Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the Firestarters video series. My name is Steve Scheier. I've worked in cannabis since 2018, and I talk and I write about power, and I offer leaders in cannabis leadership guidance that you can use and create curated advisory boards for them. I'm the co-author of Power Up, the essential tools for cannabis leaders, which is available on Amazon. Go take a look at it if you're interested in improving your leadership. Our guest today, I'm really excited about. I have had the opportunity to meet Chris several times, and I'm really thrilled to have him on the show. Chris Eggers, who's the CEO of his security company. And the reason I wanted Chris on the show today is because Chris is a former police officer, which we'll get into, of course. But Chris has some very unique and thoughtful views about providing security to cannabis facilities. And Chris, it's a great pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so very much for being here.
Nope. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So Chris, let's start off as I start off with every show is what is the state of cannabis in your state? What is the state of cannabis in California?
Great question to ask, because if you ask 10 people, you may get 10 different answers. But right now there's a lot of discussion about high taxes, a lot of discussion about lack of access. There's a lot of discussion about social equity and, allowing people into the industry who helped build it. Those that were affected on the war on drugs, or by the war on drugs. So, the state of cannabis in California right now is a bit up in the air, I would say. It's hard to pinpoint what one problem might be, but I would say taxation, social equity, and regulation are key topics that we continue to hear people and operators struggle with.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Chris, as I mentioned in the beginning, you have a history in policing. Maybe you could tell the audience about your policing history briefly, and then talk about why you decided to form the company that you've created.
Sure. Yeah. Don't hold it against me.
No, I find it to be a really fun and uplifting story. So please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. So it's true. I was a cop for a little over 12 years. I started my career with the Oakland Police Department, and then I lateraled to the San Francisco Police Department for a collective almost 13 years. All of my time was on the street, on patrol, and some undercover work as well. Working undercover for the Oakland Police Department was super unique. I got to learn intimately what offenders look for, think about, what motivates them, in a way that law enforcement officers just don't. When you're wearing a uniform, my experience is that people typically, see the uniform, not the person. Obviously, law enforcement can do a much better job of seeing and dealing with people and their individual, needs. Obviously, we've seen some pretty egregious acts by law enforcement, and so law enforcement certainly has a long way to go to get better. But my experience being in uniform is that people saw the uniform first rather than the person, and that creates a different barrier, right? There's certain information that a uniformed officer is just not going to get, that I was exposed to. Pretty, I say intimately, working undercover, working around and with admitted burglars, admitted robbers, admitted drug dealers, admitted drug users, up close and personal. I learned a lot, got to debrief a lot. And, that level of education and experience really allows me now to add value to my clients in a way that, I think other consultants may struggle with. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of classes you can take, a lot of initials to achieve, but those are earned at the end of the day in a sterile, static environment. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of value there. But the experience that I was able to gain, working around admitted offenders, literally walking up and down streets, being pointed out to, this is what I look for. This is the place I'm going to hit and why. This is the place I'm going to stay away from and why. That type of education and information is super unique. And that really, that experience is what really started the light bulb in my head of like, wow, this is, not everyone is exposed to this, and I really embraced it.
So you could have stayed a police officer. What was the impetus to getting out of that life and into this life?
I have a family member who struggled with alcoholism for quite some time. Me and this family member had a great relationship. And alcoholism definitely, was a pain point in his life. And I saw it affect negatively various relationships, including ours. He, found sobriety uh, through the use of cannabis, and is, an excellent man today on any barometer that matters. He's a
Mhm.
great father, a great husband, all up and down the board. And I always follow up with this. I'm not making the claim that cannabis cures or treats alcoholism, but I can point to one relationship in my life where cannabis had an amazing effect on, the individual consuming it, and the other relationships that spawned off of that. And so I've always been really fascinated with cannabis, and being in law enforcement, you hear, the reefer madness. You hear how bad of a drug, cannabis is, and you hear all these negative stereotypes. But in my own personal life, I didn't see that. I saw quite the opposite, and so I was always very curious. San Francisco PD, working for that organization, really opened my eyes to life after law enforcement. I'll say that experience really made me start to think if this is the career path that I wanted to stay on. And in law enforcement, you typically don't leave. You retire out or you transfer to another department. And so when I resigned, they didn't really know how to treat it. And people were looking at me like I had a nose growing out of my forehead, like I was totally nuts. I'm 39 years old. I have a 1-year-old on the other side of that wall. And I knew I wanted to use my skill set in law enforcement, in an area that interested me, that I could add value in. And I was lucky to find the cannabis industry, and I was even more lucky to be welcomed into the industry by folks who helped build the industry. And so I think, adding value to the operators first and foremost has allowed us, in some ways, to be accepted in the industry, and added a level of credibility that, I was on a call today with a vendor who asked me, how do I get into cannabis? That's a question I get asked by various vendors occasionally. I think that they missed the mark a little bit, with all due respect. This industry was and is built on the backs of people who, have had their doors kicked in, who have gone to jail, who have had a lot of sleepless nights. And now I think it's really important that we make sure that we, include those who help build it, first and foremost. But me personally, I try to add value first. And, I believe that the business will come second. But,
Yeah.
cannabis is super unique, and has always interested me.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think that virtually every person I've spoken to does have an emotional connection with the plant and the industry. Yes, people are trying to make money. God love them. They're trying to make money. It's all good. But virtually every person I've spoken to has some sort of emotional connection to the plant and to the industry, like your relative that you were talking about before. You saw the value that he achieved, or people who have various other kinds of chronic illnesses and diseases. So it's always very gratifying for me to hear these stories because people tell them all the time.
And here's an example of how I think normalizing consumption, whether it be for adult use or medical use. I have friends, I have clients, I have, people in my life that consume for various reasons. Some straight medical, as, to help with, some sort of condition or ailment or pain. Some people consume, adult use, in a similar manner that you or I might share a cocktail,
Right.
and all across the board. But, one thing that I found super interesting being a cop is, the drug policy, right? Working as a cop, I couldn't consume cannabis. I would have been fired. I would have been, first suspended and then ridiculed on some level and then fired.
Are you
But
tested regularly as a police officer?
so every agency has different policies and procedures, SOPs around that dictates that. In the agencies that I worked for, it was after an injury, accident, and or some sort of shooting. Now, I was never involved in either. I actually worked 12 years as a cop, driving a cop car. Most days. With I have one partner who's going to laugh at that in San Francisco because he did all the driving and I did all the running. But
Well, at least you had a good division of labor.
exactly. Yeah, there was definitely a division. I'll tell you that. No, but after an injury, accident, or after a firearm discharge. So I was fortunate to go through my career without experiencing either. And so I didn't get drug tested outside of, getting off of the probation period. But what's interesting is I could go home, down a bottle of whiskey, the night after my shift, wake up hungover, which, as we know, is
Right.
still under the effects of alcohol, even though it may not be in your system,
Right.
right? And no one will bat an eye.
Right.
And I knew guys, in working in the city that wouldn't drive because they were hungover, and so their partner drove, and that was like not a problem. But I can't go
Uh-huh.
home and have a gummy and maybe smoke a little bit to relax. I think that's ridiculous.
Chris, I really want to get into your vision of the company, and thank you for all of that. Believe me, you're a fascinating person to talk to. I want to get into your vision of your company and what you're trying to build, and what you think the market need is. Why are people so receptive to what you're trying to build?
I look at things a little bit differently, and that doesn't mean that I'm the guy that's right in the room. It doesn't mean I'm the guy who's wrong in the room. But I look at security differently than other consultants that I've interfaced with and orbited around in the cannabis industry. A lot of people right now are very focused on the guards and the value that they bring, but they're not super focused on the limitations of that guard or even the liability that they bring. And we have a lot of use cases and data around guards. There's an uptick, I think, in premise liability and negligent security claims. I'm the CEO of a small but growing security consulting and risk mitigation firm, but I get calls from civil attorneys all the time, that are suing cannabis businesses for one of those things, negligent
Hmm.
security or premise liability. And so,
Right.
where we look at things differently is risk mitigation and the holistic security solution. Right now, the status quo is a broken system. It's band-aid, patchwork, stovepipe, are some of the ways that I describe it, of various service providers with no management, no auditing, and no allocation of risk. Some of these vendor contracts are extremely predatory, extremely one-sided. I mean, I'll give you an example of a conversation I had with a video monitoring company. And video monitoring is a third-party provider. They tap into your cameras, and typically after hours, the analytics will go off on the screen and create an alarm for the person monitoring to look at, and then they can voice down using a speaker at the facility and speak to this individual, and tell them, hey, you in the red hoodie, or you in the quarter zip blue shirt with the fuzzy background, get off my property, or we're going to call the cops. And so I asked the question, hey, what happens if he or she's playing Tetris and misses it, and my cultivation team gets hurt? What then? And honestly, some of the answers from even the big providers, I won't say the names, is well, we have a $1,500 deductible policy. I mean,
Yeah.
how we are really focused on changing the paradigm of security and finding the right vendors that allocate the risk appropriately, so that they are held accountable for their actions or non-actions. And right now, operators in the cannabis space are holding a ton of liability. I fear that they don't realize. And that's just one example. I could go down rabbit holes about insurance and insurance requirements. I have a client who engaged with me after an incident. The very next day, they became my client. We started working through security assessment, and unfortunately, they're going to realize that their insurance claim of several $100,000 is going to go, to zero, because they didn't have the right door installed, the right locking mechanism. And so, right now, again, the status quo is a piecemeal band-aid stovepipe culmination of various vendors with very little oversight and auditing.
Putting together, I imagine, a holistic plan for each client, and you're bringing in, I imagine, where you're not actually providing services, you're bringing in services that you can supervise in a way, to make sure that they have the security solution that they need.
Every facility is different. Every facility has its own needs and risk profile and budget. But essentially, our clients are increasingly asking us to take ownership of the security solution, and that is a culmination of various vendors. Obviously, there's some things that we're aware of and knowledge that we have that are very specific to the cannabis industry that other vendors haven't been exposed to. But yeah, we are acting essentially as the general contractor, if you will,
Right.
for the holistic solution, and that'll vary and look differently facility to facility.
Yeah, for sure. So, what's the best client for you? Who are you most targeted and focused on engaging with these days?
We have clients of all license types, but I think people generally look at retail first as the folks that get hit hardest. with some of the recent incidences, not just recent, but some of the more publicized incidences that we've seen with respect to burglary and robbery. But I have clients that are affected by a lot of these issues that aren't retail. They have indoor cultivation or distribution, and you can look at a city like Oakland, for example. They have very specific zones that these businesses need to exist in, and that's very common. But it's not just retail that's affected by theft and criminal activity and liability and risk.
Right.
It's license types all across the board.
Yeah. So what do you think, how is your company going to grow in the next few years? What are you looking for in terms of growth?
We're really just focused on adding value to our clients and obtaining new clients and adding value there as well. Again, the cannabis industry is super unique, and I have the utmost respect for the legacy operators that help build this industry. And so, where we see this headed is just to continue to, understand what those pain points are and come up with ways and creative solutions to address them.
Yeah.
Again, the status quo in the industry with respect to security is, it's broken. And we're changing that little by little, and we are looking forward to 2022 to continue to add value to the industry. Again, with law enforcement background, with me specifically, and regulation and local regulation continuing to fall on law enforcement, there's a huge value add there to have somebody on your team that speaks that language. Because no disrespect to law enforcement in that industry, but they know it better than anyone else. They have the ability to put up smoke and mirrors and speak a language that's very hard to decipher. And we understand that like breathing. I existed and excelled in that world for quite some time. And I think that's probably one of the things that I get the most joy out of, is interfacing with law enforcement now that I'm on this side.
This wasn't on our list of questions, but if you had 2 tips for a cannabis operator from a security point of view, what would they be?
I would say twofold. One, insurance is a huge consideration point that I think people typically miss. That's a whole rabbit hole I can go down, but I would say review your insurance policy and understand what you have.
Right.
The second one would be, again, I don't want to beat up on this industry because they do provide some value, but the guard industry has been hit extremely hard by COVID, similar to the restaurant industry.
Right.
Finding quality people to fill these roles and retain them is extremely difficult. And right now, the industry continues to rely really heavily on guards, but they don't understand the risk and liability that takes place when that happens. And we're able to provide our clients with solutions that reduce the guard hours and that liability, but increase the security coverage, based on the needs of that facility.
Yeah, I've certainly been to many dispensaries, and I see guards outside, and I got to think, this must be the most boring job in the world. It's like hours and hours of tedium, punctuated, if you're unlucky, with a couple of moments of terror, right? And yeah, I mean, it's so hard when you're standing a post like that, I imagine, to stay focused. It's so hard to really even be aware of what the risk is. And I will see these guards as I'm driving by dispensaries, and I'm thinking, God, they are just like targets.
And here's one consideration point, that I really want operators to understand is they guards serve a function, and a very important function. But if done incorrectly, can really bring a lot of liability on the owner,
Right.
and on that business. The ways that you can lose your business in the cannabis industry isn't just a takeover robbery or a caravan burglary. Surviving the incident is extremely important, and human life is paramount. But as a business owner, once you survive that night and your people are safe, you want to get back up to business running, quickly, efficiently, and compliantly. And in order to do that, you need to have the right processes in place.
Yeah. All right, so Chris, as we're wrapping up here, and thank you again for your time today. You have been delightful, as you always are. As I said, I write on power and leadership, and I know you have a copy of my book. So when you think about power, what do you think of? Many people think, I did a little video a couple of days ago, which I haven't put out yet, where I reflect on the fact that people have asked me, Steve, why did you write a book on power? Aren't there enough power-hungry people in the world? And my response is, this is not for those people. Most of the people who are in the world that are power hungry get no notoriety for their power hungriness, so to speak, But I'm more worried about the people who are underpowered, and there are a lot more people who are underpowered than are overpowered. The people who are overpowered, yes, they get a lot of notoriety, but there's not as many of them as the people. So when you think of power, what do you think of, and what does the cannabis industry need to do in order to be more aligned with its power, do you think?
Great question. It's funny you answered that similar fashion that I thought about it. I think about power, and you can think about the power hungry people, but the underpowered. You know, Listen, to be totally honest with you, as a new business owner, if you will, right? My firm is now a year old. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's days where you feel extremely powerful, and days that you want to feel more powerful,
Right.
right? And
Oh,
I
for
think
sure.
that rings true to anybody, not just in the cannabis industry, but can apply to a lot of different areas, right? So
Absolutely. Rings
when
true
I
for
look,
me, for sure.
yeah, when I think about power, I think about confidence. I think about having a clear direction, and I think about continuing on a path that you really believe in. Even if people disagree with you, even if there's naysayers, that's totally fine. My hope is that the underpowered become to feel more powerful. And
Yeah.
I've met a ton of people in this industry that have gone through and experienced things that I really honestly can't even imagine, and they're extremely powerful. And my hope is that they realize it, because I get a level of confidence from a lot of people that I orbit with in the industry.
Yeah. All right. So, Chris, as we wrap up here, tell people how they can reach you. And please go ahead and do that.
Sure. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, Chris at ccsecurity-solutions.com. That's our website, ccsecurity-solutions.com. And hopefully we're not too hard to find. If we are, I need to call my SEO guy.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully not. I'm sure it's great. And so, Chris, thank you so very much for making the time today. Chris, something I've always been wanting to ask you: are you related to Dave Eggers?
I'm not, but I do get that question quite a bit. Um, as as far as I
Well,
know, no, there's no relation. I'm actually looking forward to crossing paths at some point, because I get that question all the time. I doubt though that Dave Eggers ever gets asked if he's related to Chris
oh,
Eggers.
I don't know. I'm
Uh,
sure he
but
does.
maybe that day's coming.
I'm sure he does. Maybe that day is coming.
And when it
Uh,
does, I'm going to reference this interview. You know it.
exactly right. All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much for making the time, and we will look forward to talking to you again soon.
Cheers. Always good to see you.
Good to see you.